After a year overseas, I was finally coming home. The deployment had been tough, long nights, endless training, and the kind of stress that makes you appreciate the little things. I'd spent countless hours imagining that first morning back, coffee in hand, sitting on my dock, listening to the water lap against the shore, watching the sunrise paint the lake in gold and orange. That was supposed to be my reward: quiet, peace, and the familiarity of my lakefront property. I pulled into the driveway, humming a tune I hadn't heard in months, and then stopped dead. 3 large villas now stood where there had once been empty land, my carefully maintained shoreline replaced with perfectly manicured lawns and brand new fences, white signs with bold letters read HOA property rented for guests. My stomach dropped. I blinked several times, thinking maybe I had misremembered the layout, but no. The villas were real, all of them, and all of them were on my land. I got out of the car and walked toward the closest villa. 2 people were sitting on the porch, sipping coffee and laughing as if the world belonged to them. I waved nervously. "Hi, I think there's been a mistake. This is actually my property." They stared at me like I was some random person who'd wandered onto the wrong vacation rental. "Oh, sorry, we rented this villa last week," one said cheerfully, clearly not grasping the idea that I actually lived there. I took a deep breath and tried to reason with myself. Maybe this was some new HOA initiative I had missed in emails while deployed. Maybe they had simply renovated and shared the lakefront in a way that I didn't fully understand yet. I laughed bitterly. My emails had indeed piled up over the year, but not even in my worst nightmares did I expect to return and find strangers living in my backyard. Pulling out my phone, I opened the rental apps I knew the HOA had been using. My blood ran cold. There it was, all 3 villas listed for short-term rental, booked solid for the next month, and there it was again, my name listed as the property owner. Every photo, every review, every guest rating proudly listed me as the host. One guest even wrote, "Amazing lakefront view, best trip ever." Best trip ever indeed, but apparently without me even being home to enjoy it. I dialed the HOA office, hoping for some explanation that didn't involve legal loopholes or fraud. When they answered, the cheerfulness in their voice was infuriating. "Good morning, how can we help you today?" I explained calmly. "I just returned from deployment and I think there's been a mistake. My property is being rented out under my name and I don't know why." There was a brief pause and then, "Oh, that's perfectly legal. All you need to do is sign these forms to confirm." I stared at the phone. Sign forms for what? For someone else to continue renting my property while I was away? My blood boiled. I hung up and paced in my driveway, looking at the villas and the strangers enjoying what used to be my private sanctuary. It was surreal, almost like a bad dream. I could see the HOA in my mind, pushing paperwork, collecting fees, pretending everything was above board, while I got home to find my lakefront transformed into a mini resort. I wanted to scream, but instead I took a deep breath and reminded myself to think strategically. Military training kicks in here. You assess, you gather evidence, you plan your next move. This wasn't just an HOA mix-up. This was a deliberate, audacious misuse of my property. I walked along the shoreline trying to take it all in. The water was calm, reflecting the early evening sky, the perfect contrast to the chaos that now surrounded me. Part of me laughed bitterly at the absurdity of it all, me back from deployment, dealing with a HOA-led rental empire in my own backyard. But laughter quickly turned to resolve. I wasn't going to let this go. This was my home, my property, and I wasn't going to hand it over without a fight. That night I sat on my dock, staring at the villas lit up in the distance, guests moving around as if nothing had changed. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the water crimson, and I made a silent promise to myself I was going to reclaim my property piece by piece and uncover exactly who thought they could turn my lakefront into their playground. Little did I know, the fight was just beginning, and the HOA wasn't going to make it easy. The next morning I woke up with one thought pounding in my head. I needed proof. Proof that those villas weren't just some new HOA initiative, proof that my name was being used without permission, and proof that my lakefront was no longer mine, even though legally it should have been. I grabbed my laptop and pulled up the rental apps and websites where the properties were listed. I couldn't believe what I saw. All 3 villas were live, complete with descriptions, photos, and glowing reviews. "Beautiful lakefront retreat, highly recommended," one review read. Another, "The cabins were spotless and the view breathtaking." I scrolled through guest photos, people kayaking on the lake, lounging on my deck, even barbecuing where I used to have my fire pit. My stomach twisted. Every image was a reminder that my sanctuary, my home, was being lived in by strangers. And then came the kicker, my name, spelled correctly, listed as the owner and host. Someone, or more likely, the HOA, had put my name on all the rental agreements, confirming the bookings, collecting payments, and probably laughing the whole time. I sat back in my chair, rubbing my face. Did they really think I wouldn't notice? Did they think I'd return from deployment and just let it slide? I called the HOA office again, this time with a little less patience. "Hi, I'm calling about the villas listed under my name. I've just returned from deployment and I need to know why these are being rented out without my authorization." The voice on the other end was annoyingly cheerful, as if they were delivering a weather report instead of explaining how they'd been defrauding me. "Oh, everything is fine, sir. It's all standard procedure. You just need to sign these authorization forms and everything will be official." I froze. Sign authorization forms? That's the part that made me laugh out loud bitterly. "Excuse me," I said, "I already own the property. Why would I sign a form authorizing someone else to rent my house?" Silence on the line for a second, then, "Well, it's just for paperwork purposes, standard protocol. Don't worry, it's fine." "Fine, fine," my blood boiled. I hung up and leaned back, trying to calm myself. My next move had to be strategic. I couldn't just storm into the villas and start yelling at guests. That would make me look like the crazy homeowner who lost his mind overseas. No, I needed documentation, witnesses, and a plan. I grabbed my camera and started walking around the property, taking pictures of the villas, the HOA signs, and even the small details, the locks, the mailboxes, the private property signs that had been ignored. Neighbors began to peek from their yards. Some waved, clearly sympathetic, while others glanced nervously and hurried back inside. One elderly neighbor came over and whispered, "You're not the first one this has happened to. The HOA likes to get creative with rentals and names." My jaw dropped. Creative? That sounded like a polite way of saying they were committing fraud. By mid-afternoon, I had compiled a growing pile of screenshots, photos, and notes. I started plotting my next move. I needed to confront the HOA in person and demand answers. I wasn't going to let this slide, but part of me also wondered about the tenants. They were innocent pawns in this, and I didn't want to scare them unnecessarily, though the thought of reclaiming my property from people who had no idea they were living in someone else's home felt surreal. I made a mental note: first, gather proof. Second, confront the HOA. Third, protect my property and ensure it could never happen again. As the sun dipped behind the hills, I walked down to the dock. The lake glistened under the evening light, calm and serene, mocking the chaos surrounding my villas. I took a deep breath. This was no longer just about missing out on the peaceful mornings I had imagined. This was about standing up, reclaiming what was mine, and showing that no amount of HOA bureaucracy or shady paperwork would keep me from my home. And somewhere deep inside, I realized the fight was just beginning. Whoever thought they could rent out my property under my name had no idea I had returned, and I wasn't leaving without a battle. The next morning, I decided it was time to go directly to the source, the HOA office. Sitting at my lakefront the night before, I made a plan. I would remain calm, polite, and collected. But as soon as I stepped into the office lobby, I realized just how naive that thought had been. The receptionist barely looked up from her computer as I walked in. "Can I help you?" she asked, not looking particularly interested in helping anyone. I explained my situation quickly. "I just returned from deployment and my property is being rented out under my name without my authorization. I need to speak to someone in charge immediately." She finally glanced at me and picked up the phone, calling someone in the back. After a brief pause, the HOA president herself appeared, a woman with the kind of posture and expression that makes you feel you're already in the wrong for daring to question her. "Hello," she said, extending a hand I didn't shake. "I understand you have some questions about the villas." Her tone was sugary sweet, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. I felt like I'd just stepped into a corporate boardroom designed to make people like me feel small. "I do," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "I just returned from deployment and I found 3 villas on my property being rented under my name. I need to know how this happened and why my permission was never requested." She smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, it's all perfectly legal. Everything is in order. You just need to sign a few documents and the paperwork will be official." I blinked. "Sign documents? I already own the property. Why would I sign anything?" She waved her hand dismissively like I was being childish. "Standard procedure, it's just a formality. These villas are part of the HOA's community rental program and we handle all management tasks on behalf of owners." I could feel my jaw tighten. The HOA's community program was nothing more than them taking ownership of my property without consent. I asked her to show me the paperwork. She handed over a stack of forms, contracts, rental agreements, and some HOA memos. I flipped through them and immediately recognized my name signed in several places, but the signatures weren't mine. Someone had forged them. My stomach turned. The HOA had not only rented my property but had also fabricated my consent. I leaned across the desk, pointing at the pages. "These signatures aren't mine. I didn't authorize any of this. You've committed fraud." She raised an eyebrow and shrugged. "Oh, mistakes happen. We can fix it. You just need to sign here to confirm your ownership." I slammed the stack back down. "I'm not signing anything. You need to undo all of this immediately, and I want proof that the rentals stop. Now." For a moment, she seemed flustered, but she quickly recovered her composure. "Sir, you don't understand. This program is designed to benefit owners. It's completely legal. You could even make money if you participated." I laughed bitterly. "Make money? You're renting my property under my name without my knowledge. How is that beneficial to me? How is this legal?" She leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "The law is complicated. You might want to consult a lawyer." That was the moment I realized this was going to be bigger than I'd imagined. The HOA had not only ignored my rights, but they were also counting on bureaucratic loopholes to defend themselves. I left the office that day with a clear mission: gather evidence, talk to witnesses, and build a legal case. But as I walked back to my lakefront, I felt a mix of emotions: anger, disbelief, and a strange sense of determination. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about principle, about standing up to an organization that thought it could steamroll someone who had served overseas. By the time I reached the dock, the sun was dipping low over the lake. The villas glowed warmly under the fading light, guests moving around oblivious to the drama unfolding. I took a deep breath. I had a plan, a strategy, and a growing pile of evidence to support my claim. The HOA had made a critical mistake. They assumed I'd be passive, that I'd return quietly and accept their community program. They had no idea I had just come home, and I wasn't leaving without reclaiming what was mine. After my first tense encounter with the HOA, I knew I couldn't confront this situation blindly. I needed evidence, solid, undeniable proof that someone had used my name, forged my signature, and rented my property without permission. The problem was HOAs are masters at paperwork. They have endless memos, forms, and official letters designed to confuse and intimidate homeowners. I was going to need patience, strategy, and a little bit of luck. I started by talking to neighbors one by one, carefully testing the waters. Some were sympathetic, others were tight-lipped, like they had something to hide. One neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, an older man who had lived by the lake for decades, leaned over the fence and whispered, "You're not the first to come back from somewhere and find the HOA has expanded your property. Be careful, they like to keep things under wraps." I nodded, making mental notes. Mr. Jenkins didn't exaggerate. The HOA had been quietly renting out properties under residents' names for years, pocketing the fees while claiming it was all community benefits. Next, I started digging through emails, documents, and online listings. I compared the rental dates to my deployment schedule, noting every instance where my property was being rented while I was halfway across the world. Every email, every booking confirmation, and every guest inquiry that listed my name as the owner became a piece of evidence. The pattern was unmistakable. The HOA had systematically created a rental operation using my property without permission. I also started interviewing tenants carefully. I didn't want to scare them off or make the situation more complicated. Some were oblivious, they thought they had legally rented the villas. One young couple even complimented me on the fantastic service provided by the HOA. I had to hold back laughter and anger at the absurdity of it all. Here I was, standing on my own property, while guests were thanking the HOA for managing my home as if it was theirs to rent. As I collected evidence, I noticed something else: patterns in the HOA's paperwork. Forms were slightly different, signatures misaligned, and dates that didn't match. Whoever was handling this had tried to cover their tracks, but the inconsistencies were glaring to someone paying attention. I photographed everything, made copies, and documented every detail meticulously. Military training kicked in. I treated it like an operation, with reconnaissance, documentation, and strategy. By the end of the week, I had gathered enough evidence to make my next move. The HOA had underestimated me. They assumed I would return, accept their explanations, and maybe even sign the forms they presented. They didn't count on me investigating, talking to neighbors, interviewing tenants, and uncovering the inconsistencies in their paperwork. I had a growing pile of documents that clearly proved fraud, deception, and abuse of authority. Still, part of me worried about the next step. Confronting the HOA directly could be messy, and taking legal action meant drawing attention from tenants who had no idea they were part of the dispute. I knew I had to be careful. One wrong move and the situation could spiral, giving the HOA a chance to bury evidence or drag out proceedings indefinitely. One evening, I sat on my dock, reviewing my notes and photos. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the water. Everything seemed calm, the kind of calm that hides chaos beneath the surface. I knew the battle was far from over. The HOA might have thought they were untouchable, but I had the truth on my side, and that was more powerful than any signature or contract they could forge. That night, I made a plan. First, I would confront the HOA again, armed with the evidence I had collected. Then I would document everything on the property itself, ensuring no tenant could claim ignorance. Finally, I would prepare for legal action, ready to fight not just for my property, but for principle. The fight for my lakefront had shifted from disbelief to determination. I wasn't just defending land, I was defending my rights, my home, and my peace of mind. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but feel a little excitement. This was no ordinary HOA dispute. This was a challenge I had trained my whole life to face. I wasn't going to let them win, and I was about to show them exactly what it meant to underestimate someone who had returned from deployment ready to reclaim what was theirs. After a week of investigating, documenting, and mentally preparing myself, I knew the next step was unavoidable. I had to face the people actually living in my villas. I hadn't wanted this confrontation, not because I was afraid, but because I knew it could escalate quickly. These tenants were innocent pawns in a scheme orchestrated by the HOA. Yet standing there, watching strangers lounge on what had been my property, I realized I couldn't wait any longer. I had to assert my presence quietly, carefully, but firmly. I drove down the winding path to the lake, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. The villas looked immaculate, like the HOA had poured money into maintaining them while I was away. Every deck, every window, every inch of the lawn was perfect. Part of me wanted to marvel at it, but I quickly reminded myself that it was all someone else's idea of control over what was mine. As I approached the first villa, I saw a young couple on the porch, sipping coffee and laughing at something on their phones. I waved awkwardly. "Hi, I actually own this property," I said, my voice steady but firm. They froze, glanced at each other, and then laughed nervously. "Oh, the HOA said you were part of the program, that you manage the rentals," the woman said, clearly trying to explain away the confusion. I blinked. Part of me wanted to scream. No, I wasn't part of their program. This was my property, and no one had my permission to rent it out. "I'm not managing anything," I said, holding my hands up in a neutral gesture. "I came back from deployment to find these villas being rented under my name without my consent. The HOA is responsible, not you, but you need to know that this is my home and this is not legal." The man looked genuinely confused, and I could see the panic beginning to creep in. "Wait, so we've been staying here illegally?" he asked. "Yes," I said, trying to keep my tone calm, though my blood was boiling. "The HOA took advantage of my absence and rented out my property. It's not your fault, you were misled. But I'm reclaiming what belongs to me, and everything has to stop immediately." They were silent for a moment, processing this information. Then slowly the woman said, "We didn't know, we thought it was legitimate." I nodded, understanding their confusion. This wasn't personal. It was the HOA being reckless, greedy, and frankly arrogant. I spent the next hour walking through the property, explaining which areas were private, taking notes of anything unusual, and politely asking them to vacate immediately if their stay overlapped with my ownership rights. I documented everything, the conversations, the interactions, even the way the tenants were moving around the villas. If this ended up in court, nothing could be questioned. By the time I left the lake that evening, I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Relief because I had finally made my presence known. Exhaustion because the battle was clearly going to be long, complicated, and stressful. I sat on the dock, watching the sun reflect off the water. The villas glowed warmly in the distance, a serene facade hiding the chaos that had unfolded. But I also felt a spark of determination. The HOA thought they could run an operation under my name without consequence. They thought I would accept their paperwork, their lies, and their excuses. They were wrong. Every detail I had documented, every conversation I had recorded, every inconsistency I had uncovered would be part of my plan to reclaim my property. That night I drafted my next steps: compile the evidence, confront the HOA again armed with undeniable proof, and prepare for legal action if they refused to correct the situation. I knew the tenants were innocent, but their ignorance didn't change the fact that my home had been exploited. I had to act decisively but carefully so that justice, not anger, dictated my moves. As I stood at the dock, the water calm under the moonlight, I realized this was bigger than just reclaiming property. This was about asserting my rights, standing up to bureaucratic abuse, and showing that no organization, no matter how entrenched or confident, could trample over someone who had fought for their country and returned ready to defend their home. The villas stood there, silent and gleaming, almost daring me to continue. I smiled grimly. I wasn't just going to continue, I was going to win. After my encounter with the tenants, I realized there was no turning back. The HOA had overstepped in the boldest, most audacious way possible, and they clearly weren't going to correct it voluntarily. I had gathered evidence, rental listings, forged signatures, witness accounts, but the next step would be the hardest: taking this fight into the legal arena. I called my lawyer first thing the next morning. He was calm, methodical, and the kind of professional who could take a mountain of paperwork and turn it into a legal weapon. "From what you've described," he said, reviewing the photos, emails, and documents I had collected, "this is textbook fraud. The HOA has acted outside their authority, and we can take this to court, but we'll need to build a rock-solid case." I nodded, my mind racing. Rock-solid wasn't enough. I wanted airtight, unassailable, and humiliating for the HOA. We spent the next several days strategizing. I went through every email, every rental listing, every HOA notice, and cataloged them meticulously. My lawyer explained that the HOA would try to argue community property management or standard procedures, but those excuses would fall apart under scrutiny. I felt a surge of satisfaction. All the months of preparation, all the painstaking evidence collection, it was about to pay off. The HOA, of course, sensed the shift in momentum. Within days, their calls started coming in polite, passive-aggressive, and full of subtle threats. "Perhaps you don't understand the program fully," one administrator said over the phone. "Maybe you should reconsider participating before escalating things further." I laughed bitterly. Reconsider participating? This wasn't participation, it was theft. And I had no intention of bowing down to their thinly veiled intimidation. I also made sure to document these calls. Each one, every single exchange was recorded and noted. I knew that in court, any sign of coercion or deception would strengthen my case. It was exhausting mentally and emotionally. Some nights I lay awake on my dock, staring at the moonlight dancing across the lake, thinking about how audacious this entire operation had been. Who in their right mind would rent someone's property under their name, forge signatures, and think no one would notice? The arrogance was staggering. Meanwhile, I reached out to the tenants again. I wanted them to understand that they were part of an ongoing legal issue. Most were cooperative, some apologetic, and a few outright confused. I had to reassure them that they were innocent and that the legal process was aimed solely at reclaiming my property and holding the HOA accountable. It was delicate, one wrong word, and the entire situation could escalate into chaos. By the end of the week, we filed the legal complaint. Fraud, unauthorized rental, misrepresentation, and falsification of documents were all included in the petition. I felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. The HOA had forced my hand, and now the fight was official. But even as I prepared for court, I knew this wouldn't be simple. HOAs are experts in bureaucracy and delay tactics. They would drag this out, confuse judges with paperwork, and hope I'd get tired. I wasn't going to let that happen. I was meticulous, organized, and prepared to see this through to the end. Every photo, every email, every note about tenant interactions had been cataloged. The HOA had underestimated me at every step, and I was determined to make them regret it. That night, I sat on my dock, reviewing the court documents one more time. The lake was calm, reflecting the stars overhead, and for a moment I allowed myself to breathe. The fight ahead would be long and stressful, but I had a plan, a team, and the truth on my side. I wasn't just defending property, I was standing up against deceit and abuse of power. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I could already hear the HOA's excuses echoing. "It's standard procedure, it's for the community, you'll understand later." But I knew the truth. The villas were mine, the rentals were unauthorized, and justice was on my side. The legal battle had begun, and I wasn't backing down, not for them, not for anyone. I looked out over the water, the villas in the distance glowing under the moonlight, and silently promised myself one thing. When this was over, my lakefront would be mine again, and the HOA would learn that you don't mess with someone who has fought for their country and returned ready to defend their home. The day of the court hearing finally arrived. I woke up early, the kind of early that makes your stomach twist with both nerves and anticipation. For months, I had been preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, interviewing tenants, documenting every detail, but walking into a courtroom is different from building a case on paper. The air is tense, every eye fixed on you, every movement observed. And today the HOA would finally face me, not through emails or phone calls, but in front of a judge. As I walked into the courthouse, I saw them, my adversaries. The HOA president was sitting confidently in the front row, flanked by her legal team. Her posture was perfect, her smile carefully practiced. The tenants were there too, some fidgeting nervously, clearly unsure of what to expect. I took a deep breath, reminding myself of the evidence, the facts, and the truth on my side. I had prepared for this, and there was no turning back. The judge entered and the room fell silent. Papers shuffled, gavel thumped, and the hearing began. The HOA's lawyer started first, presenting their side in a calm, polished voice. "Your Honor, the villas in question are part of our standard community rental program. The homeowner has been made aware of the procedures and all rentals were conducted within the HOA's guidelines." I listened quietly, my blood boiling. Guidelines. They had forged my signature, rented my property under my name, and collected fees all under the guise of guidelines. When it was my turn, I stood, feeling a wave of adrenaline. I walked to the front, laid out my evidence, and began methodically. Emails showing the bookings, rental confirmations, forged signatures, tenant testimonies, and even notes from neighbors all painted the picture: deliberate fraud and abuse of HOA authority. I explained calmly, clearly, and without emotion, but my words carried the weight of truth. The judge listened intently, occasionally glancing at the HOA president, who was now visibly uncomfortable. Her confident posture faltered slightly as my lawyer presented the final piece, a detailed timeline showing that the rentals occurred while I was deployed overseas, making it impossible for me to have authorized them. The court murmured quietly, and I could see the tension rising in the room. The HOA had assumed I would be passive, that I would return home and accept their manipulation. They had underestimated me, and now they were realizing their mistake. At one point, the HOA president whispered something to her lawyer, who quickly scribbled notes, clearly panicked. I couldn't help but notice the shift in their demeanor. Their carefully crafted arguments were collapsing under the weight of undeniable evidence. Every forged signature, every misfiled document, every rental confirmation under my name was proof that they had overstepped. The tenants looked at me with relief and gratitude. They were finally understanding the situation. They hadn't done anything wrong, but they had unknowingly become part of a scheme. I nodded at them silently, feeling a sense of satisfaction. Justice wasn't just about me, it was about restoring order and fairness for everyone affected. After hours of deliberation, the judge finally spoke. Based on the evidence presented, it is clear that the homeowner's property was used without authorization. The HOA's actions are deemed fraudulent, and all rentals conducted under the homeowner's name without consent are invalid. Immediate restitution is required, and the HOA is responsible for any damages incurred. A wave of relief washed over me. The fight had been long, exhausting, and emotionally draining, but it was over. The HOA had been exposed, and my rights as a property owner were restored. The president looked defeated, her carefully maintained composure shattered. For the first time, I realized the power of preparation, evidence, and determination. As I left the courthouse, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. Months of uncertainty, stress, and tension had led to this moment. My lakefront was finally mine again, and the HOA had learned a lesson they would not forget. I couldn't help but think back to the first day I returned, seeing those villas on my property, and laugh quietly. I had been angry, frustrated, and overwhelmed, but I had also been strategic, relentless, and patient. The sun was low in the sky as I walked toward my car. The fight wasn't just about property. It was about standing up for what's right, refusing to let bureaucracy and deceit take advantage of those who serve, and showing that determination paired with preparation can overcome even the most audacious schemes. My lakefront was mine again, and the feeling of victory, justice, and reclaiming my home was indescribable. The court ruling had finally come through, and it was everything I had hoped for. Walking back to my lakefront after the hearing felt surreal. The sun was low over the water, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and for the first time in months, I felt the calm I had imagined returning home to. But the villas were still there, the tenants still occupying them, and my work wasn't done. Winning in court was only the first step. Reclaiming my property meant taking action, and this time no excuses or delays would be tolerated. I returned the next day, documents in hand, ready to enforce the court's decision. The tenants had been informed of the ruling, and most were cooperative, relieved to finally understand the situation. Some apologized profusely, clearly embarrassed for having unknowingly been part of the HOA's scheme. I reassured them as best I could. "It's not your fault," I said. "You were misled, but this is my home, and now it's time to restore it." We went through each villa systematically. I checked the locks, verified the property boundaries, and made sure every detail matched the documentation I had compiled over the past months. For every inch of the lakefront, every deck, every dock, I reclaimed it meticulously. It was a strange mix of satisfaction and surreal disbelief, my home finally, fully, undeniably mine again. The HOA president was there too, reluctantly supervising the process under the judge's orders. She avoided my gaze, her usual arrogance replaced by visible humiliation. I didn't need to speak, the documents and the law had already done the talking. Watching her quietly retreat as I moved through the property, restoring order, was strangely satisfying. She had thought she could exploit my absence, manipulate the rules, and profit off my property. But she had underestimated the determination of someone who had fought overseas and returned ready to defend what was theirs. With the tenants escorted out respectfully and the villas secured, I finally walked down to my dock. The water shimmered under the late afternoon sun, the lake quiet except for the occasional ripple. I sat on the edge, letting the breeze wash over me, feeling the weight of months of stress and frustration slowly lift. This lake, this dock, this home, it was mine again. As I reflected on the battle, I realized it had been about more than property. It had been about standing up to an organization that had thought itself untouchable. It had been about preparation, persistence, and refusing to accept injustice. And it had been about reclaiming not just a physical space, but my peace of mind, my sense of control, and my dignity. Over the following weeks, I took steps to ensure this could never happen again. I installed new security measures, updated ownership documents, and made sure the HOA could never exploit my property a second time. I reached out to neighbors, sharing my story carefully, encouraging vigilance and awareness. My experience had taught me that complacency is an open invitation for exploitation, and I wanted others to be prepared. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood on the dock, looking across the water. The villas were quiet, the guests gone, the lake restored to its natural calm. A small laugh escaped me, part relief, part disbelief, and part satisfaction. Months of frustration, investigation, and confrontation had led to this moment. And now, the lakefront, the property, and the peace I had longed for were mine once again. I reflected on the absurdity of it all. A year overseas, and the first thing I found upon returning was someone trying to turn my home into a rental business without my knowledge. The HOA had underestimated me. They had assumed that distance, bureaucracy, and intimidation would keep me passive. But I hadn't just come home, I had returned ready to fight, ready to investigate, and ready to reclaim my life. As night fell and the stars reflected on the calm surface of the lake, I realized that victory was more than legal, it was personal. The peace I had imagined during deployment was finally real. I had defended my home, upheld my rights, and shown that determination, patience, and preparation could overcome even the most audacious schemes. Sitting there, the water rippling gently under my feet, I smiled quietly. The fight was over. My home was mine, the lakefront was mine, and the lesson I carried with me was clear: never underestimate someone who has fought for their country, and never let anyone take what's rightfully yours. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.